All right, so this is set up where most people should have a basic overview, basic knowledge of Flexi, but just for people who might be newer to it, we're just going to go over some basic tools. Um, the first thing I'm going to point out are on the top and side are your toolbars. They're going to look a little bit different for everybody because they're customizable. There's a default setting. This one's pretty close to that, but you can add and remove toolbars. They can be moved around and flown out like into a little floating tool window if that's how you like to look at it. I like mine set up like this. Um, Down at the bottom, we have swatch tables. The Avery Dennison edition of Flexi defaults to just our simple traffic colors with the cut contour swatches and then a black, gray, and white. You can open up other ones. You can make custom swatch tables. So if yours looks a little different, this is all customizable. Across the top, we have our basic menu, our file, edit, view, arrange up here at the top. That's pretty straightforward with any software. We'll talk about the artboard. That's this big, or workspace, as it's also called. That's this big white space in front of us here. You'll notice that we have a rectangle in there. That is a visual guide. It's there by default. The default size is 36 inches by 24 inches tall. That can be turned off or the size changed. If you want, most people like to have it turned off. If you want to turn it off in your Design Central window right here, there's an additional options button, and you can just click this show border. Another tip that a lot of people like to use as well is they like to set this width up to be the width of the sheeting they're going to be printing on, or the material they're going to be cutting their signs out of. So I have this one set up for, it's 36. This is the default, but we can change the size of that as well, and make it anything we want, really. So it's just a visual guide. This border will not print. That's a pretty common question that we get. It's just there for your convenience. So I pointed out the Design Central window. This changes with the tool that you have selected. And so, for example, if I have something selected, it gives me different options here. The other one that we're going to be focusing on in this webinar is the fill stroke editor. This is where you can change the color of the fill, or the main body of an object, or the stroke, which is some people call it the outline, but there's another tool called an outline, which we'll actually get into here. So it's called a stroke. It's just basically the line on the outside of the object. Going back over to toolbars, you'll notice on my toolbar, I have a selection tool at the top here. We'll be using that quite a bit. Our text tool is something we'll cover. This is called a Bezier path tool. We won't get into that today. It's a little more of an advanced thing. The next thing we're going to get into is our shape tool. This says arrow tool, and you'll notice that some of these tools have a black triangle in the bottom right-hand corner of the tool. That indicates that there's an additional stack of tools behind that can be flown out in a flyout menu. So if you just click and hold down, your other tools that you can select will come up. So I'm going to go from my arrow tool to my rectangle tool, which is the default, what most of your toolbars probably look like. The other thing we're going to work on, you'll see me using quite a bit, is our zoom tool. There's a few different things. You have your basic zoom in and zoom out. You also have a zoom tool that will let you select an area and zoom into it. And the other one that I'll use a lot is my zoom to all objects. It's this magnifying glass with the green triangle and the orange circle. If I click that, it takes everything on my artboard or my workspace and fits it inside the viewable area that I have open. This is really helpful that if you have a random artifact somewhere off in the distance of a file and you're not sure why the file is bigger than it should be, you can press zoom to all objects and see if it zooms way out to find a little floating object somewhere. We'll talk about, one of the things we're going to talk about in this class is MUTCD signage. A lot of that revolves around highway fonts, and highway fonts are not default installed in Flexi. You have to buy those separately or obtain them separately somehow. They are installed on Windows. If you move your Flexi license, for example, the fonts don't come with it. You need to copy them from your fonts folder or another place that you have them saved on your computer. If you do get them on your computer, you just simply right click on them in Windows and select install or install for all users, depending on how your Windows is set up. So those are some things that are probably going to be questions that'll come up for some of you. Just wanted to get those out of the way. So in this webinar, the idea is that we're going to be getting an MUTCD sign print ready. Now, there's a few different types of MUTCD. The one that's typically referenced when talking about it is the federal MUTCD, which would also be in some cases called the North America MUTCD. It's for those that might not be familiar, it stands for Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's an agreed upon set of traffic control devices that are agreed upon between the United States of America, Canada, and Mexico, so that drivers going between those countries have a pretty consistent experience and understand traffic control devices and for everyone's safety. That said, some states and regions have their own supplemental or additional MUTCD, and those are not typically available in a library of print-ready files like the MUTCD library that we sell, which is federal only. So that leaves people in areas that have these extra manuals to have to get their files ready or design them from scratch another way. The two examples I'll be using in this class are California and Texas. The examples I'm going to pull up are technically property of California and Texas. We're using them for educational purposes only. But we'll go into two examples of that in two different ways that they're typically encountered, the files are typically encountered, and how to get them ready to either print or cut. So typically we'll find the files in two different formats. One is the easiest, it's called vector. And what that means is that the image is made up of clean lines and geometric shapes that can be scaled, resized, manipulated without affecting the resolution or the quality of the image. The other type is called raster or bitmap, and those images are made up of a bunch of tiny little dots called pixels. And the problem with those is you can't easily manipulate them. You can't size them without getting into resolution and fuzziness issues. These two Avery Dennison logos are a good example of that. The black Avery Dennison logo being a vector one and the red being a raster or a bitmap. If I zoom in here, we can see that the black stays nice and sharp, but the red logo starts getting some blurriness or chunkiness from the pixels. So if we were to wanted to print the red one large, it's not going to look very good. How you can tell the difference between these things and Flexi is, other than the obvious resolution issue. When I select a raster or a bitmap, I get this selection box around it. And it's this red line with these little white square handles, and it goes around the entire image. The other thing you'll notice is in Design Central, we get this extra bitmap tab with the little image of a tree and a sun on it. So that's an indicator that you have a bitmap selected. If you select something that's vector, this is sorry, my example is not that great at the moment. So this vector is a good example of when you'll find a vector that has a object on it called a mask. A mask is a hidden rectangle or object that is there to lock some things together and constrain proportions of an object. It's usually added by if somebody's using like Adobe Illustrator and outputs the vector as a PDF, you'll get a mask on there. How we know the mask is on there, I have this selected and it's selecting much like the bitmap did, but I don't have the bitmap tab in the Design Central window. And if I right click on it, like I did just then, I get this option in my flyout window to unmask. If I unmask, our mask becomes turns black. So in this case, it's a rectangle. A mask can be pretty much any shape, but I can deselect and then pull my mask off and get rid of it so that behind the mask, I can select my vector objects. And you'll notice when I have vector objects selected that the entire geometry of the object is being outlined in that red selection indicator rather than the bitmap, which is just the box around. So I'll get rid of these here and we'll pull up an MUTCD example. So I'm going to go into the easiest one first, which is the vector. So I have here this is the Texas State MUTCD library. You'll notice that that's 64,000 kilobyte size file. It has many pages on it. I don't want all the pages. I've gone into the file on a PDF viewer. You could use a web browser as well and selected the sign I want to work on today. So I'm going to select this file here, say import, and I'm going to get this select page dialog. If you have the option of bringing in one page or importing all the pages. If you import all the pages, which is this radio button down here, it's going to be a lot of information on the screen. That's going to be really hard to dig through. You can if you want to do something like that, but I don't recommend it. The sign that I want is on page 250 of the document. Again, I just pulled that up in a PDF viewer and found the sign I want to work on and looked at what page it was on. So I'm bringing in page number 250. The next thing I'm going to see is this import text as paths. There's two things you can do at this point. You can either bring them in as paths or not. If you bring in your text as a path, it turns the text information in the file into essentially just shapes, and they can't be clicked on, and you can't change spelling and things like that, which is fine for this example that I'm bringing in. If you need to manipulate the text and change a word, for example, you would uncheck that box, and then if you have all the fonts that are in that file, it will open normally. If you don't have the fonts, it will take you through a series of substitutions where it'll give you the font that it's trying to bring in, and then you'll have to find a matching font on your computer. That's what I would call more of a little more of an advanced thing. So we won't go into that today, but just know that you'd have to do it if you need to manipulate the text. I'm going to bring these in as paths though. When I say okay, I get this outline of what the file I'm bringing in, the space it's going to take up on my workspace, and I can click to place it. So this is a do not pass sign. We'll notice that some of it looks like vector and some looks like bitmap. It's actually all vector, but there's a mask there. So to get this print ready, we need to get rid of this other stuff that we don't need. But for the sake of knowing what my measurements are, I want to keep this. So I'm going to just make a copy of this. And my favorite way to do that is to hold the control button on my keyboard. And you'll notice when I do that, the cursor, my cursor changes from white to black, and I get an addition of a plus symbol in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'm going to hold control and then click and drag. That's going to move and copy the object. So I have a copy that I'm not going to touch so that I can reference back just in case I mess anything up. So I'll come back over to my first one. When I click any particular object, everything gets highlighted. That's because it's grouped. There's a few ways to ungroup. My favorite though is to just right click and then select ungroup all. And then you'll notice now I can click on individual things, and I can move them around. I can delete them. I could change the color if I wanted to, but we're just going to get rid of some of this. So I'm just clicking my mouse and dragging to make a box to select these things. And I'll just get rid of the stuff that I don't want. Now we come to the part that's masked. Again, just like I showed you with the Avery Dennison logo, I'm going to right click on that and select unmask. I know that this is a masked vector because when it's selected, I don't have the bitmap option in the Design Central window. So I'll select unmask all. There's our black mask there. And then here's our vectors behind here. So we have all these measurement guidelines from the specification drawing that we need to get rid of now. One way you could do that is go in here and select each individual thing and delete things one at a time. My personal favorite way is to click and drag everything and then hold shift on my keyboard while I click everything I want to keep. So I'm going to hold shift and then I'll click and drag down here to grab any of my rectangles, my borders or anything. These are stacked into a couple different rectangles, and rather than trying to click on all these little lines, I'll just click and drag like that. I'll do it one more time. So I'm holding shift, clicking and dragging to select that back. And then I'm just going to click on all my letters to keep the legend from the center of the sign. Now I have everything unselected that I want to keep. So I'm just simply going to press delete on my keyboard. And that's all cleaned up, and I have everything that I want to make my sign ready. The only issue with this is that when we have this selected, you'll notice in Design Central that our proportions are probably not what we want. We don't want a 5 3/4 inch tall do not pass sign. Nobody's going to be able to read that. So we want to make it a printable, usable size. So if we notice over here, and most of you should be familiar with what one of these spec drawings looks like, but for those of you who might not know, you'll notice we have the letters next to all of these size indicators, and they'll correlate to a size down here in this table. So for example, if we were printing this do not pass at 24 inches wide and 30 inches tall, we would look at A, which is our width, find A and the 24 inches, and then the 30 inches tall. This is going to tell us, for example, C, it would be found up here. This is our offset from the edge of the sign blank, the offset from the edge of the sign blank to the edge of our border. And then D would be the thickness of the border. For example, P is our radius on the edge of our sign, and then it gives us other information like the height of our letters. If you look next to the measurement on the, for example, F, so for the line that says not, it will tell us that we need a 6-inch, and then it has a D that's standing for the Highway Series D font. Again, some of you might already know this, but some people this might be new to them. So I'm just covering some of these basic things. So we want to make this 24 by 30, and right now it's a 4.3 by 5.7 and some change sign. So in Design Central, I can change, for example, I could just come in here and say, oh, I want it 30 inches tall. Notice that stretches it out. So a handy tool is this proportional button in Design Central. If I check that box, it'll constrain the proportions when I make changes. So I'm going to come back up here and say that I want to make it 30 inches wide or 30 inches tall. Now, notice to keep the proportions of this file correct, when I make that 30 inches tall, it's only 22.497 inches wide, which is obviously smaller than we want. So that just basically means that this base drawing we're working off of is not proportional. It's probably proportional to one of the other sizes on here. But in this particular case, you would need to redraw the border. We're going to get into that on the next example, so we won't do it here for the sake of time. But just keep that in mind, that if you are bringing in a vector, you want to make sure that the proportions are coming out right. Otherwise, you're going to print this out, laminate it, put it on a 24 by 30 inch blank, and you're going to have really big white borders up the sides of your sign, and it's just going to waste time and material. So like I said, we're going to do the border on the next show you how to make a border on the next example, and how you would center a legend. But this is how you would break out and get rid of all the extra stuff you don't need if you were lucky enough to have the sign that you need to make available in your state manual in a vector format. So I'm going to bring in a raster example at this point. One thing I'll point out here is you'll notice that I'm going to file and import rather than file and open on my files when I bring them in. The reason I'm doing that, it's kind of a best practice. You don't necessarily have to do it, but if you're bringing in, especially a file from a network drive, if you just click file and open, the software is accessing that file while you're manipulating it. And if you have some kind of a network outage, there's a chance you could corrupt your file and lose it forever. Because of that, it's kind of more of a clean process to do file and import, make whatever changes you need to make on that file, and then save over your original. That way, if you make a mistake or you have some kind of a power or network outage, you're not risking your files, and it keeps you from wasting your time. So I'm going to click File, Import, and I'm going to bring in this California example here, this raster example. It's going to give me this import text as paths because there's a text artifact in there that I'll point out when it opens up. But typically, if you bring in a raster, you won't get this because there won't be text. So I'll bring that in and then size it up so everyone can see it a little better. So you notice this looks similar to when selected to our last one, but the key difference here is that we have a bitmap or a raster image versus a vector on the last one. There are some vectors in here, so I'm going to right click here and ungroup so I can figure out what those are. What these are from is from this original drawing that was drawn, it looks like back in June of 1983. It was digitized, and the program that they used to scan that in traced recognizable text and created vectors on top of it. You could, in theory, use these shapes and change the color of them to use for your legend on your sign. That doesn't do us any good at showing you how to redraw one. So I'm just going to get rid of these vectors here by pressing delete on my keyboard. There's a couple key differences on this drawing. The biggest one being it's not giving us multiple sizes, and it doesn't give us a table. Rather than calling out a table, it just has the measurements right on the drawing indicators. I picked this particular example because it goes across a few things to watch out for, and it sets up where I can show you guys some tips and workarounds that I work on or typically use. The other is that this also highlights a common question, a common problem with doing things like this, where the font, the highway font has been updated slightly, so that if we make this drawing exactly how this spec is calling for, it won't actually fit correctly on the sign. I'm going to purposely run into that so that we can see a couple different ways to get around that. So like I said, this is a bitmap. When we select it, we get the box all the way around, and we get the bitmap tab in the Design Central window. So we're going to, we can't go in here and just change colors. It's not a cuttable object that a cutter can do anything with. It's not set up where we can assign true traffic color, spot colors to it. It's basically useless from a traffic sign standpoint, other than just being a guide we can draw from. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to recreate this text here. So I'm going to grab my text tool. Notice when I grab my text tool, I have my Design Central changes. So I have a text here. I have not placed a text object in my workspace yet. Anything I change in the Design Central window without having something selected or placed in my workspace will become my new default. So my default right now is a highway C, and that's indicated by this top drop down. The ones I'm using are named T2000 Highway C for traffic 2000 series Highway C. There's different ones on the market. There's ones that will say Highway Gothic C. There's ones that will say, but they'll say different things. They might say Highway Series 2000 C, but for all intents and purposes, this is they're the same. We can change our font size. It's important to note that the font size is based off of the capital letter X in your font set. This is a thing in typography just across the board. It's not specific to traffic. The reason that's important is when you have an S or an O, and I'll show you, or a capital G, for example, the curve of the letter actually hangs below the baseline of the text. So the O is actually a little bit taller than a capital X. And I'll point that out when I show you a tool and get to that point. Moving down, we have character width scale. This is the actual width of the character or the letter. So if we change that, the letter can look stretched or squished. But it is a trick you can get around if you need to fit a line of text into a sign. There's character slant. That would be if you need to italicize something. And then tracking, in some programs, it's called leading. It's the distance between letters. Vertical offset, we don't typically use in traffic because everything's on the same plane. And then we have the line spacing, which we'll get into here. So I'm going to go ahead and make my text. I'm going to keep this my default for now, even though we're going to change it. So I'm going to type in the words that I need for my legend. And you'll notice that I am typing this a little bit funny. Let's say you're in a hurry and you type that in. Obviously, we need this all capitalized. Flexi has a nice little tool built into it so that you don't need to go back and change that. With your text selected, if you come up to the top and click on your text menu, you can come down to this case option, and you can select how you want to change the capitalization or the case of the selected text. So for example, toggle case will do something like that. If we want title case, so just the first letter of each word capitalized, we can do title case. In this case, we want everything uppercase. So we'll go to text and case and click uppercase to make everything uppercase. One thing I did when I was typing that in that I think I skimmed over, between lines, I was just pressing the enter key on my keyboard to break these apart into lines. I could just type these out in one big line, but that removes a handy little trick in Flexi. So I'll do an extra example here. So if I want to break these apart and manipulate them individually, under the text tool here, I have this text and break apart. if I have my words in different lines, it breaks them apart line by line. But if I were to type all my words out in the same line and do the same thing and break that apart, it's going to break apart all my individual letters. So that's why for this example, I'm doing this in lines. And again, I'm just going to type that in so I can break these apart easier. So I have my text information in there. Now I need to make it per the specification. So I'm going to select my text, go into my character tab on my Design Central, and then reference my drawing over here. So the first thing I see is that I need a 5-inch letter E. When that calls 5-inch, it's calling for a 5-inch character, as in the height of the actual letter of the capital letter X in that font set being 5 inches. So that's going to correspond to the character height. So we'll make that 5 inches. And we notice that next to 5, we have an E, which will be our Highway E series. So I'm going to select that from my list. And then the next thing we'll see is that we have a call out of 4 inches between lettering. I'm going to show you 2 ways to achieve this. So I'm going to copy and paste this. So I have 2 of these. The easiest way to do it, and the one that's going to be the most true to the drawing, is going to be the line spacing. This is grayed out because it's set to automatic line spacing. I'm going to click this change button here and select specify, because I want to specify exactly what that's supposed to be. The line spacing, if you notice on this little ABCD example, it goes from the bottom baseline of a line to the next bottom baseline. So if we want 4 inches between those characters, we're going to want this to have the spacing plus the height of the character. So I have a 5-inch character and I want a 4-inch spacing. So my line spacing should be 9 inches. And that's going to give me a 4-inch space from the baseline of this text to the top of this text. But if you notice this line here that goes across the bottom of the text, that from this line to the top line is our 9 inches, because we have our 4-inch space and our 5-inch character. So that's a 5-inch Highway E with 4-inch spacing. I'm going to move that aside for now, and we'll come back to it. And we'll talk about a different way to space these out. So the other way you can space these out, and this would be handy if you're respacing something that was the text brought in as a path, would be to break these apart like I showed before. Go to text and break apart. And then we can use a spacing tool within Flexi. So I want to space all of these out 4 inches. I want to space them and use my top point as my anchor. So I'm going to select that first. Whenever you're using an align or a space tool in Flexi, the first thing that you select will be the anchor point that all of your other objects align to. So I'm going to select the flash and hold shift on my keyboard so I can select multiple objects, and click my other 2 objects. Then I'll come up here to my arrange, and I will select spacing. Notice on this menu on the right hand side, across from where it says spacing, there's a J. That indicates that the J on your keyboard is a keyboard shortcut for getting to this same menu. So rather than moving the mouse up and selecting that every time you need to do something like that, I'll select these again. I'll just hit J on my keyboard, and notice my Design Central will just jump to my spacing menu. When I do that, it will give me a distance. That distance is going to show what an average It's going to average out the spacing between your selected objects right off the bat. Obviously, we want that to be 4 inches. So we'll tell it 4 inches and I'll press enter. That's going to give me a preview of where it's going to move objects in the form of an outline like we see there. So it's going to move the flood and the area down. Before I do that, I'm just going to point out that we have a horizontal spacing option. So if that was checked, we'd get something that looked like that. We obviously want the vertical. The next thing down is we have an end to beginning and a beginning to beginning. So that's just adjusting the where the space measures from. So it either does the left side or the top, depending on if you're doing horizontal or vertical. Beginning to beginning would go to the top of the first object to the top of the bottom object. We obviously are concerned about the spacing between the lines, so we want the end to beginning. Okay, we want that 4 inches. I'll press enter. It'll give me my preview. I like my preview. I can press enter again, or I can check this apply button to move that out. Now, in theory, this text is 4 inches apart. And if you were to measure from the top of the O on flood to the bottom of the S on flash, that would be true. It's 4 inches. But because we have the curved letter makes the letter a little taller, we're actually a little bit further apart between, for example, the bottom of the L on flash to the top of the L on flood. And I can show you that with a guideline, and I'll show you how to use these guidelines. So a guideline in Flexi, if you just click on your top ruler at the top of your workspace and hold down and drag, you'll get a guideline that will come down. This is really helpful for lining things up manually or making sure things follow a line. These lines can be used to align and center things too. They're a selectable and alignable object in the workspace, but they will not print and they will not cut. They'll also save in your Flexi file. So if you save your .fs Flexi file with your guidelines in it, they'll stay there. But again, they won't output. If you export as a PDF, if you send something to a printer or cutter, these blue guidelines will not show up. You can also change the angle of them if you want. If you need some kind of specific angle you're matching something to, but those are just handy little things. Again, you just click your ruler and drag onto the workspace. You can do one from the side as well. If I want to get rid of them, I just click them and then press delete on my keyboard and they go away. So you'll notice when I have that line going across my straight bottomed letters, that my curved letters like my S, and then if I do another one down here, my O's, they actually sit above that line. And in most drawings, most spec drawings, when they're calling out the 4-inch spacing, they're concerned about the flat letter distance, not the curved. So this would probably be, to use the adage, good enough for government work, and no one's going to notice. But if your engineer is particular, or you want to do everything, to a T, to the letter, that's not necessarily going to work. But if you're making a sign for a parking lot or something that's not necessarily a spec'd out sign, that spacing tool will work just fine. So I'll get rid of that. The next thing we want to look at is in this particular drawing, and this isn't typical. You don't see this so much anymore. It's calling out individual widths for each individual line of text. The problem with this one is that it's an older font. So the font sets has been updated. So these measurements don't actually work. And in fact, this particular example, and one of the reasons I chose is because it runs into this problem, and I can explain it, is that it's saying that the distance between this this F and the H is 26.3 inches, when in reality, and we'll see here in a minute, this the 26.3 is actually the distance between the border on the inside of the border on this sign at that level when you have this centered, which becomes a problem because the letters are touching the edge of the border, and that poses an issue with legibility because there's not a break between the border and the text. But I'm gonna, just in case you need to, we'll talk about how to get these close. So I have my 4-inch spacing from line to line. I'm going to break these apart so I can change each individual line. So text and break apart. So now I can select these. Notice I've got my drawings calling for a 26.3 width, and I've got a width of 23.52. It's really tempting to just come in here and say 26.3. But you'll notice because I have my proportional checked, my text is getting taller. So I'll click my undo button up here. You can also use Control Z, which is what I've been using. So then I'll say, okay, I'm going to take my proportional off and do it. If I do that, it's going to stretch my letters out. That poses an issue with legibility. So we don't want to do that. The ideal way to do this would be, and this has changed because I've manipulated it, is to change the tracking. Again, in some instances, this is called leading, but we can change this in increments of 2 percentage points. If I bump this up to 14, I've got 26.325. That 0.025 is probably not going to be an issue for most drawings. You could come in here and manipulate this down until you got it dead on somewhere, and change this down to the 1,000th of a percent. But that's going to take a lot of time, and it's probably not going to be something that's going to be noticed. I'll leave this one at 14. This one is a 25.65. So I'm just going back to this tab here and checking the width and getting it as close as I can. And then this one is a 20.75. So I've got 20.72. So that's about as close as we're going to get it there. Now we're going to make the background. I'm going to keep these from moving around in relation to each other. I'm going to click and drag these. I'm going to right click, select combine, and then group. And what that does is make it so they're all locked together so they don't move around on me. I'm going to move those out of the way while we make the background with the border on the sign. So on our drawing, we've got a 36 by 36 inch square that's turned 45 degrees to be a diamond. Rather than making a diamond and laying it out like this, we're going to lay it out as a square. That makes the measurements a little bit easier to handle. It also is how you're going to want to cut or print the sign anyway. So to do that, I'm going to grab my rectangle tool here. I'm going to click to place a rectangle. This is already a 36 by 36 because that's my default. If I wanted to change that, I would just simply change these measurements. Notice I'm in this rectangle tool here and I don't have a proportional. It's because I'm manipulating my original rectangle. If I were to click off of this, the rectangle tool, and now I have the design central proportions, which gives me or dimensions, it gives me the proportional option here, and I can get back to my rectangle tool by clicking on the tab here. I want a rounded corner, and This particular drawing is calling out half the radius size at 1 inch. So we'll make this a 2-inch radius. Signs are going to vary, but for this drawing, that's what we're going to put in. So we'll change this drop down to rounded and then put our corner radius at 2 inches. So obviously this is a warning sign, so it's going to be yellow. So we'll select traffic yellow, and we need to put a border on this. The border in Flexi is called is created with a tool called an outline tool. There are other ways to put a border on an object in Flexi. This is just the way that I like to do it. So with my rectangle selected, I'm going to come up here to effects and outline. And this basically draws your outline just right out the bat. It remembers the last outline that you made, which happens to match what I'm already working with. But just to give an overview of that tool, you have by default, you'll have this top drop down will be outline, and it's going to actually put the line outside because it is an outline. But that tool has the option to change it to an inline. Moving down, you have the width of the line, which would be the width of this black part. Right now, it's just a wireframe example of what it's going to look like. Once we apply it, it'll become solid black. In our drawing, it calls for a 7/8 width border. So we have the 0.875 width. Our offset distance is the distance you want that inline or outline, if you're doing it that way, from the edge of your original rectangle or your original object. So in this case, our drawing calls for 5/8. So we have 0.625 in there. One thing that you could do in Flexi on any field where you can input a number is it will take math. So you can double something by putting in ×2 in there. You can cut it in half by dividing it by 2. You could even put in millimeters. So I could say, oh, I want a 10 millimeter offset and type 10 mm. So I'll do that here to show 10 millimeters, and it will do the math to get it back to inches for me, just the conversion on the fly. The other thing is, rather than trying to figure out what 5/8 is, that it's 0.625, if you don't know that off the top of your head, you can just put in 5/8 of an inch and then press enter, and it will put the 625 in there for you. I want my color of my outline to be traffic black, because this is something that I probably want to print. And then I want to keep the original. That keeps your original shape. If I uncheck this, it will get rid of my yellow background, but I want to keep that. So keep original is going to be checked. So I like the way that looks. So I'm going to press apply, and I'll get my border. Now I want to center my legend in my sign. Most warning signs are the legend is centered as if it's a square, not centered as if it's a diamond. So if we look at this flash flood area drawing here, the distance from the top of flash to the peak of this diamond versus the bottom of area to the bottom of the diamond, those are not the same measurement. So if we try centering it with the centering tool, it's actually going to put the legend higher. So we want to center things when they're in a square format. If you look closely, you'll notice the distance from the 45-degree angle to the peak of the H, and then the 45-degree angle to the peak of the F, and then the 2 A's on area. Those are all the same distance. So if this is turned at 45 degrees, this legend's actually centered as if it were a square. And I should probably point out how I did that. So that's your rotation tool on Design Central. Whenever you have something selected, you can select your rotation tab, and you can rotate things around manually like this, or you can go in and tell it what angle you want it at, which is actually how we're going to get this legend there. So we're going to bring this legend over, and we'll notice that it's behind the background. Whenever you make something in Flexi, any new object stacks on top of the everything that came before it. Obviously, that's not going to work. So we're going to move this forward. I'm going to select this, our legend, and I'm going to say arrange, and then I'm going to go down to order. Notice I have keyboard shortcuts, shift, and then your page up and page down. If some keyboards don't have those, or they're under some other function in the keyboard. So that's why I'm showing it here rather than the shortcut. So I can tell it to move forward one, and it will jump forward just one layer. If I had made a bunch of different objects on there, I would have to click that multiple times to get it to step forward till it was where I want it. If it's something that I just want on the top of everything else, just right off the bat, I can go to that same align and order and just say to front, and it will do the same thing essentially. But if I had multiple objects, it's going to bring it all the way forward. So now I want to put this at my 45-degree angle. So select the object in Design Central. I'll select my rotate tab, and I'll tell it to put it at a 45-degree angle. And now I want to center this out over here. To do that, I'm going to use another align function in that arrange menu we were just in. I'm going to select the sign background as my anchor point. So that's what I'm aligning to. I'll hold shift and select my legend. Then I'll say arrange, and then I'll come here to align, and I'll say both centers. And now we're noticing the issue that that the original font set, or it could just be a simple typo in this original drawing, but our lettering is teetering right on the edge of our border. That's not the best for legibility. If you dig into the MUTCD, there's some information about things touching borders. We don't really want that. So what we're going to do is just, I'm going to quickly, without explaining everything I'm doing here, I'm just going to remake this. I wanted a highway E, 5 inches, and I want this to be a 9-inch. To have my 4-inch space here. So now this is all just standard font. If I rotate this one to 45 degrees and I get rid of our one that we made exactly to spec, and then I do that same thing. So I centered this in here. Again, I held shift and selected my legend, and I used a keyboard shortcut there. The keyboard shortcuts, again, are set up in this fly out window. I used Control 5 to do both centers. If you think of your number pad on your keyboard as a square, the 5 is on both centers. So Control 5 will align it to both centers. A 4 will align the left edges. Control 6 will align the right edges. Control 8 will do the top. Control 2 the bottom. It's set up just like you basically press the number that's in the location where you want to align your things. That's a good way to remember that. So if we take a look at this at a 45-degree angle next to the one we just typed out with the standard spacing, it's looking about the same as the drawing. So in this particular case, it's either, like I said, that font was updated, but it's more likely the engineer that drew this probably just made a typo and accidentally read the measurement between the border rather than the measurement of the lettering. Again, this drawing was made in 1983, so there's a lot more manual things going on in making these. So at this point, we have a sign that's ready to put out and ready to print or cut. That's going to vary by user. if you're using a print system, you'd make sure that your colors are the proper spot colors for your print system. And then you may need to add a bleed or something like that to the sign. We won't get into that stuff today because we're kind of towards the end of our time and at the end of our agenda. But hopefully that gets everybody some tips and tricks and maybe some shortcuts or even just a baseline knowledge of how to take these MUTCD drawings and make them a printable sign.